Okay, so welcome to everybody to our NCAS seminar series. Today we've got a talk from Professor James Lee. He's going to talk to us about the last couple of months' data from some of the super sites and DEFRA sites on trace gases. James is an NCAS staff member and is based at the Wolfson Atmospheric Chemistry Laboratories at the University of York. So I'm just going to mute everybody, make sure everybody's muted for the presentation. And then I'll unmute everybody and then they can you can mute again. But if you've got any questions, you can put it in the chat and we can go to them at the end. So if you just put your, make it clear that you have a question. Okay, so James, can you share your screen?
Yeah. Is that shared now, Katie? Can you see that?
Yeah, it looks good to me, yeah.
Okay, good. Hello everyone. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the effect of the COVID-19 lockdown on UK air quality. This is some work that myself and two PhD students, Will and Shona, have been doing over the past few weeks. Most of the plots that I'll show have been through the work of Will and Shona, who are PhD students at, in York with me. So just as a brief introduction, about the outbreak. We don't need to spend too long about this. First identified in China in December 2019, and I didn't really know whether to put this up because it's a bit morbid, but 3.1 million cases as of yesterday, over 200,000 deaths. But what that's led to is some quite severe travel and workplace restrictions throughout the world. And it's just a list of some dates that we've looked at in the UK, with the first cases appearing at the end of January, the first UK transmissions appearing at the end of February, and then the first UK death early March. But then the sort of key things are mid-March, 16th of March, with the first government statement to avoid non-essential travel and contact with others, suggesting working from home. And then the 20th of March with the schools and restaurants and pubs and clubs and such things closed. And then shortly after that, then the 23rd of March with the full sort of lockdown and already going out for very particular reasons. And so this sort of work was, I guess, inspired by some satellite data that appeared in the press earlier this year. And this is from the ESA Sentinel-5P satellite showing NO2 density over China in January, or early January, and then the change to at the end of February as China introduced its lockdown. And then you can get a similar picture over Europe. This is actually March and April 2019 data and March and April 2020 data. So just comparing the sort of lockdown period, if you like, between this year and last year. But what we have access to in the UK is a very extensive network of in situ monitoring stations, so stations at the ground run by DEFRA. At least that's most of the data that I'm looking at is from the DEFRA AURN network, which is about 150 currently active sites. And they measure a range of things, but pretty much all of them measure NOx and sulfur dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and particles. There's a very small amount of sites that measures VOCs. They're the Marylebone Road and Eltham in London, and I'll talk a little bit about the VOCs as well. And then what Will and Shona have done is to use the data, access the data using the OpenAir R package, and then use R to kind of handle the data and produce a lot of the plots that I'm going to show. But it's all publicly available data. I guess I should point out that any data over the past 6 months from these sites is not ratified and could sort of change with final QA and QC, but we'd like to think it probably won't change all that much. So first thing we looked at was some of the sort of obvious sites. So this is from Marylebone Road. Those that don't know, it's this sort of cladded shipping container just opposite Madame Tussauds in London. It's pretty well known sort of super site. And these, what Will has plotted, these, what he's called air quality stripes, which show they're coloured by NO2. So it's the median NO2 level for each day of the year from 2015 to 2020. And as you're sort of going through the years, you can see actually that the levels in 2019 are a little bit lower than previous years. That was as the ultra low emission zone was introduced into London. And these vertical lines are the three of the key lockdown dates, with the last one here being the whatever it was, the full lockdown on the 23rd of March. And you can clearly see after that the drop in NO2 at the Marylebone Road site, both compared to the pre-lockdown period and also compared to the previous sort of 5 years. Quite a lot of the stuff I'll talk about will be comparing this year's lockdown period to the same period in the previous 5 years or 3 years, just to take out any sort of seasonal variations that we might get. And on the bottom plot here, if we look at PM 2.5, actually the picture is not as obvious. You can't really pick out a change all that much between the pre and the post-lockdown period. It's a bit lower in 2020 than it has been in previous years, but certainly the picture of PM 2.5 is nowhere near as clear, even at this roadside site, as it is for NO2. This is now NO2, the same plot at the top, but then this looks at the difference. So this takes the difference between a particular day and the median of the previous 5 years of that day, and you can see a clear drop in NO2 concentrations where the stripes go. And if you do the same thing for PM, you've got a less sort of bright blue. So there is a bit of a drop, certainly compared to previous years, but there's not much change, like I said before, from the pre and post lockdown period. If we plot this, which is something a bit more, there's a really nice visual plot to show, but plot it as a time series now, and the sort of the light coloured trace is each day's daily median, and the thick line is the rolling 5-day median for 2020 in the blue, and the average of 2015 to 2019 in the green. And you can see as the lockdown period came in, clear drop in NO2 with an increase in ozone. I'll talk a bit about ozone very briefly at the end. But like I said, with the particles, you can't really see much of a change. And there's even this period here, which is around about the beginning of April, where the particulates are actually higher than they were at the same point last year. So the particle story again is coming out as not being as clear. If we move to North Kensington, which is classed as an urban background site, and for those that know the project, a few years ago it was where the Clearflow campaigns took place. And this is kind of more indicative in an area where people live. One of the things with looking at roadside sites is actually during the lockdown, if you're looking at sort of people's exposure, in particular for health effects, actually people are not spending a lot of time on the roadside. Where people are spending time is in their homes and around about their homes. So we thought it's important to look at these urban background sites as well. And actually the change in NO2 is much less clear in the urban background than in the roadside. That there is a drop. We see this period of increase as well, and the levels are less than the previous 5 years, although they were pretty much for the rest of the year as well. So the urban background sites, again, things are not as clear. So they're two very different single sites. What we then decided to do was to just aggregate the sites together. So this takes now, these are the same plots, NO2 and PM 2.5, but averaging all the urban background sites in the UK and all the urban traffic sites in the UK. And again, the picture is similar. You can see the drop in NO2 across the urban traffic, not much change, and some increases in particles. There is a drop in the urban background, but it's not as stark. It sees a similar structure to the urban traffic, but the drop isn't as much. So we have to think a little bit about meteorology. This is quite a busy plot, I realise, but actually this shows wind data from the Chilbolton Observatory. Not all of these, very few of these urban atmospheric observatories have actual met stations. But you see, actually, since the lockdown and the wind direction data blew in 2020, blew for 2020, you can see we've been in this period of easterly flows, actually, which we saw last year as well. Reasonably low wind speed and easterly flows, which would be conditions that you might expect air pollution to be higher than if we were in this sort of westerly period, which we got in the pre-lockdown period. I'm not doing much with this Met data, but it's just kind of indicative to show that, you know, as well as just looking at levels, we have to consider what's happening with the meteorology as well. In particular, things like transport of PM from Europe. So if we look at these aggregate sites, just on the actual levels, what we can see is the NO2 dropping around about 32% at both site types. This is a drop between the average of 2015, 2019 to 2020. Sorry, that's pre and post lockdown, 45% less in 2020 compared to 2015 and 2019. But as I showed with the time series plot, the PM has actually increased. And if you aggregate everything together, there's very little change in 2020 compared to 2015, 2019. So this is not my work, this is not our work, this is work done by David Carslaw and Stuart Grange, who have looked at individual sites. This is the sort of raw NO2 data, and the shaded areas are the lockdown periods, and you can see, like I showed, at some sites you can see a clear drop, at others it's less clear. But what they do, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, is use sort of statistical models to remove the effect of the weather. And if you do that, then pretty much across every site you see a drop in NO2, and this is kind of shown as, you know, this is kind of thought as it's a drop compared to what the NO2 would have been if under sort of normal conditions, or what we would have expected it to be. So it's just quite a nice way of showing it. Like I say, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but it does show that the expected NO2 the NO2 that we see is a lot lower than what we would expect it to be under normal conditions. Pretty obvious what the reasons are for this. This is data taken from the government's daily briefings on transport use. And you can see since the 16th of March, the use of motor vehicles has dropped to around about 25 or 30% of its normal use, and other transport as well, although I think these sort of dips here are the weekend effect. I think this is probably Easter weekend, and then, but you can see a slight increase in vehicle use as we're getting to sort of, you know, the present day. So this is something obviously we want to look at as we're going forward. So that's removing the main source of NO2, but the complication with PM, of course, is that it's also from a lot of other sources. So I'm not going to talk much about them, but I know there's some work done in Manchester that has shown the signal from some, you know, solid burning fuels and burning garden waste, some occasionally from moorland fires, and then from long-range transport as well. So we're removing most of the NO2 source. You know, 60–70% of NO2 potentially comes from vehicles in the UK, but not removing as much of the PM source. Now these are just some sort of nice plots. We can divide this up into different cities. So in each of these, the top plot is the NO2 with the rolling median, again 2020 being the blue, average 2015 to 2019 being the green, and then the dashed lines being the 3 of the key lockdown dates. And you can see the behaviour is kind of similar, but certainly cities in the south are seeing a lot less throughout the whole year actually than during 2020. But cities like Manchester, Leeds, certainly Belfast and Newcastle have seen the more significant kind of drops in NO2. So this is going to be really interesting to look at. A lot will depend on how many sites these are, that they range from like 3 in some of the cities to like sort of 10 in London. So we want to look at where these sites are and look at, have things been different in terms of traffic flow across the different cities. But once again, on these plots, it's hard to see the trend in PM 2.5. And then we can turn this into an average. This is quite a busy plot, but the top one is the difference pre to post lockdown, with the orange being NO2 and the purple bars being PM. You can see across all the cities, there's basically a rise in PM. I should point out, these are urban background sites in all the cities, not traffic sites. So you can see a drop in NO2, but varying a bit, like that big drop in Belfast and a lot less in Birmingham, Bristol and London. And then the bottom plot is the lockdown period 2015 to 2019 compared to 2020. And the average is more similar across the cities in those. And like I say, the PM, the change is much less. Probably those changes are not significant if we were to put the error bars on those. Just a quick look at the diurnal cycles, and these are in the green, the 2015 to 2019 average, in the blue 2020 average, urban background, urban traffic, NO2 and PM 2.5. And you can see that actually the structure of the diurnal cycle, particularly for NO2, hasn't really changed from one year to the next. We're still seeing the 2 rush hour peaks. It's possible that the PM rush hour peak has been flattened at the urban background sites and at the urban traffic, and we would need to look into to why that is. But you can see that actually the reason I put these up, I guess, is to just so that I think it's valid to just consider the daily median levels and the diurnal cycles that actually haven't changed all that much. I'll quickly move on to what about the rest of Europe. We'll manage to get the data from the European Environment Agency, pretty much the same methods as the AURN. And what you can see from this is the kind of varying patterns in different cities, with very significant decreases in Madrid, Milan, kind of a bit less so in Paris, a lot less of a change in Stockholm, and obviously, as we know, Sweden has treated the lockdown quite differently to the rest of Europe, so that's quite an interesting one to look at. So we have the ability, although there's to look at the data right across Europe. And I just got off Will this morning. You can go further and actually average it per country, and this is like the countries put in their nominal position on a map of Europe. So it's just quite a nice way of visualizing it. Not going to stay on that for very long, but I just think that's quite a cool plot. Then what we've done then going forward is how is this affected the number of air quality exceedances, and this is data for London. So what we've done is gone through all the sites in London, and on the top plot counted up the number of times that they breached that's supposed to say 1 hour, apologies for that, the 1 hour mean NO2 of 200, again, it's supposed to say micrograms per meter cubed, which is the EU directive. It's not supposed to be exceeded by more than 18 times in a year. And this is just for the period of March and April. So there's a site in London, I forget which one that is, I think it's Wandsworth, I assume that's what that's for. That has already, this time last year in 2019, it had already breached the 18 times. This year it hasn't had any exceedances. And in fact, there's only been, in the March-April period this year, there's only been a couple of exceedances at one site of NO2 in the whole of London. And then we did the same for PM, but looking at the WHO 24-hour mean of 25 micrograms per meter cubed. Again, sorry, I've not changed that to a symbol. And again, taking the period March to April this year and last, you can see there's been a drop of the number of these exceedances. That showing is, move on to the whole of the UK, we see the same pattern. So these is AURN sites outside of London, and we see a similar pattern both for NO2 and for PM. And so what that's telling me is that even though on average across the UK we're not seeing much of a change in PM, at the most polluted sites, and this just picks the top 10 most polluted sites, we are seeing a drop in the number of PM exceedances, which obviously has kind of, or could have health implications and positive health implications. Just quickly move on to VOCs, and this is the analysis done by Shona in York. This is London Marylebone Road, the time series, treated the same pretty much as we treated the NO2 and the PM. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but just shows what data's there, this large range of VOCs. And I guess you can see in the 2020, for quite a lot of them in the post-lockdown period, a reduction and less there than there were in the average of the previous 3 years. But if we get, and obviously that's at Marylebone Road, a roadside site. If we go to the background site in Eltham, the picture is a lot less clear, and there's some increases and not a lot of difference actually between pre and post lockdown, but also comparing this year with previous years. And obviously VOCs can be longer lived and much more subject to long range transport than something like NO2. And we can see this a bit clearer on the diurnal cycles. So what Shona's done here is pick 4 species, benzene and 1,3-butadiene, the sort of controlled species, and a couple of other kind of traffic dominated sources. And you can see that in the post-lockdown period for at least benzene and butane and ethane, there has been a drop at the Marylebone Road, less so at Eltham. Not quite sure what's going on with 1,3-butadiene, showing a very different behaviour, but again, that's something that we would need to look into. And if you sum up all the VOCs and look at the total and just look at whether there is an increase or a decrease compared to the average of the previous years, you can see at Eltham, some days there's a decrease, some days there's an increase. And Marylebone Road, pretty much since the lockdown, there's been a decrease in the total VOC loading. I'm just going to finish off very quickly by talking about ozone. just got a couple of slides left. So across all the cities in the UK, we see an ozone increase along with the decrease in NO2. Pretty much everywhere the behaviour is almost the same. This is often easier to look at if we add ozone and NO2 together. So to just look at, rather than just, if we look at the diurnal cycles, which I'm going to skip over. So if we look at the total ox, which can be thought of, total oxidant, NO2 plus ozone. And so what we see in some of the cities, like particularly ones in the south here, London, Birmingham, Bristol, there is an increase in ox across this period here. So an increase in total oxidant, not just a repartitioning of NO2 into ozone of NOx into ozone with the reduction, but an actual ox increase. This could be due to the sort of nice weather we had over that period. I don't know, but again, ozone obviously is a much more complicated problem, so it needs a lot more analysis to see if the change in NOx and VOCs and particulates is affecting ozone. Going forward as well, does this oxidant effect have an effect on secondary aerosol? So yeah, in summary, there's been a decrease in NO2 across the UK since the lockdown, which is greater at the roadside sites. The PM situation is much more complicated due to sources and meteorology. There has been a reduction across the board in air quality exceedances, taking this period, the lockdown period, comparing it to last year. And what I've been saying with any of the press stuff I've been doing, this is important, as it's kind of giving us a window into the future. So what could our cities look like in terms of air pollution in 10, 15, 20 years time, where the vehicle fleet is much more electric? Yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention. Just thought I'd put that picture up of the situation in Delhi, pre and post lockdown, to show the clearing of the skies in a very polluted city. And thanks for your attention.
Wow, that's a picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, James. Yeah, so I'll take some questions. There is a question from Till, but I think it may have been answered. So let me unmute everybody and then mute yourself again if you don't want to be muted.
Do I see the chat?
If you want to be unmuted. So Till asked about the decrease of NO2 being beneficial for human health, but then the impact of tropospheric ozone increase. But I think you kind of answered that.
Yeah, I mean, we would need to look at, so what we're going to have to wait for probably is as we get further into the year, when ozone is going to go up with the sort of seasonal cycle, and see, has there been any better? We could look at the ozone exceedances as well and see if they kind of balance out. So that is something certainly we're going to look into as we get more data, and certainly as the lockdown, as what is likely to happen is that it will be eased, but we probably won't go back to traffic levels of normal traffic levels, whatever that is, for quite a long while yet. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that balance of NO2 and ozone changes throughout the summer.
Yeah, and I had a question actually with respect to that, and the idea that as air pollution has gone down, there's also this suggestion that that the COVID symptoms have been exacerbated by long-term sort of exposure to air pollution. But then they sort of suggest that perhaps as we, as the air pollution goes up, it might exacerbate more. But do you think that's more of a long-term exposure effect, or sort of a short-term sort of effect? So as, if the air pollution was to suddenly get worse, would that then increase the cases, do you think? Or do you think it's more about long-term exposure? And do we have the data to be able to, investigate any of those sorts of links anyway? We certainly don't at the moment. And the studies on the effect, the potential increasing of the effect of COVID on people who have been exposed to air pollution in the past are kind of have to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. So there are many other reasons of people living in cities with high air pollution that could cause their COVID mortality rate to be higher. So I think, but in terms of this, again, one of the key issues, like I said, is that the biggest reductions have been seen at the roadside sites, and people are not going to those roadside sites. People are actually spending most of their time indoors probably at the moment. So, and we don't really have a handle of how this, that's why we looked at the urban background sites, because they're the best measure we have across the country of what actually people are largely exposed to. People are not commuting so much, so are not exposed to these traffics.
type levels, they're actually exposed to more like what we see in the urban background, where the reductions are quite a lot less.
Great. Simon O'Meara, do you have a question?
Yeah, University of Manchester, Simon O'Meara. What is this revealing, if anything, about sources of PM 2.5 in cities?
To me, it's revealing that there is there's much more to it than traffic. You know, that's not a total surprise, and the particle people will be able to. I know that the Manchester people are looking at this and trying to look at composition of the PM as well, and to see, you know, I think what it's revealing to me is that it's going to be a very hard task to meet any of these WHO PM recommended limits, even with a much reduced traffic fleet. Of course, what this isn't taking into account is any non-vehicle exhaust from traffic as well. So I guess that's the biggest thing it reveals to me as a non-aerosol person, is that, you know, even though we take most of the traffic off the road, we haven't really changed very much the levels of PM, apart from at the very polluted roadside sites.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I've got a couple more questions from Andrew. I wonder if anyone is looking at similar trends for indoor air quality, spending more time indoor, especially in cities, cooking more, etc.
I don't know the answer to that. I notice we've got Leah on the line, who might be more able to answer that question than me, but I would imagine that there will be some monitoring of indoor air quality going on, but I don't really know whether it's kind of done long term, and how how it is affected with people spending longer in their homes and exposure limits to that, because it's not something we've really done a lot of. Certainly not something I've done any of. So
maybe cleaning more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, cleaning, probably. Yeah, certainly cleaning more. So I'm sure there are studies going on about that, but I'm afraid I can't answer that. There is going to be more exposure to indoor air pollutants, no doubt, because we're spending more time there, and like you say, cooking more and cleaning more. But as to what the levels are and how they balance out the outside, I'm not sure I can answer that.
And another question from Belinda Howell. James, many thanks for a fascinating presentation. It's clearly a very high interest to various government departments and specialist press media. And you mentioned your media work. To who in government and media is NCAS reporting this and sharing various stories and findings? She says, apologies for her ignorance.
No, that's all right. So I don't know if people noticed, there was a call from the air quality expert group for evidence about this that is due at the end of this week, or the end of the month, so tomorrow. All of the work that I presented here, I'm pretty much finished writing into a report to that. I know that there's some people writing up the stuff about the model normalisation, the normalisation of it. So David Carslaw's writing that. No, he's not NCAS, but that's being written. And the Manchester people, I know Hugh Coe is writing up something about particulates, all to this this evidence call that went out from the air quality expert group.
Did anybody have any other questions or comments? I don't think I've missed any. Shout loudly if you do. Okay, so I think that's probably that then. Well, thank you very much, James, for a really topical, interesting talk. Next week, we've got Barbara Brooks talking about the relaunch of AMOF, the AMOF facility, which is what used to be AMF and the radars. Oh goodness, I should know the acronym for that. But basically, so it's the new facility. So it'd be really good if you could tune in for that next week. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, I think there was one more question. But did you want to, Chris? Did you want to ask it? I can't hear you. Hang on. Okay, sorry, Chris.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious, looking at the plots from David Carslaw, looking at rural background. Chilbolton seemed to have an opposite trend. Is it real or?
I don't know, actually. I haven't looked at that in any great detail. There's actually a this one. Where's Chilbolton on it? Sorry, I'm just looking at that myself. Yes, it did. Actually, you're right. I'm not sure about Chilbolton, to be quite honest. I mean, it's pretty remote. And the other thing that I didn't really mention about was emissions from agriculture, particularly on the particulates, but potentially at sites like that where, you know, probably the traffic hasn't changed very much, but obviously agriculture and things are still going on, could have an effect. So it's a very complicated picture that we'll need to look into, you know, as we get into this more site-by-site detail.
Okay, I think that's everything then. So thank James once again. If everybody can have a little clap or something, and we'll see you next week. Okay.